The first market we're going to look at is monopoly. So remember, whilst the Greek derivation of the word suggests an industry with only one provider of a good or service, this is extremely rare in practice. So more commonly we look at the UK threshold, which is to say an organisation with 25% or more of market share is a monopoly. And this is a really important threshold when we're looking at proposed mergers and acquisitions. So let's try and draw the monopoly diagram, starting off with the common axes, price on the vertical and quantity on the horizontal. I've sketched in the demand curve, and at this point we can look at why the marginal revenue curve is twice as steep as the demand curve, which requires a very minor calculus proof and is not central to the course, but may be of interest to those of a more strongly mathematical background. So, if the slope of our demand curve is given by P price is equal to A minus Q, then this point over here, the intersection with the vertical, would be point A. We remember that revenue is found by price times quantity. So if we were to extend our function, then revenue would be equal to A minus Q times Q. Simplified, this is AQ minus Q squared. Revenue is equal to AQ minus Q squared. To find marginal revenue, which is crucial to identifying the correct slope of the marginal revenue curve, we just differentiate, or essentially divide through this formula here by Q. So AQ divided by Q is A, minus Q squared is minus 2Q. So essentially, whilst our demand curve had a slope of minus Q, our marginal revenue curve has a slope of minus 2Q. So it's twice as steep. However, if you didn't enjoy that, it's not central to reconstructing the diagram. Our next step in reconstructing the diagram is to put in the marginal cost curve. So remember, the marginal cost curve tends to have what we call a tick shape. And in order to find the optimal quantity of output, then we look for the point where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. So we're here, and this is the optimal level of output for the monopolists. However, this intersection doesn't help us to find price directly. What we have to do is to extrapolate up from this point to the demand curve, like so, and then to move sideways, imagining that that was a straight line, to find the optimal level of price. So this is how we find price and output in a monopoly at equilibrium. The next central thing that we need to do is to try to identify the level of profit that this monopolist is going to enjoy. Now, in order to do that, we have to add in our average cost curve. So the crucial thing to remember when we're drawing the average cost curve into this diagram is that the lowest point of the average cost curve is where it intersects marginal cost. So this is to do with the impact of rising unit costs pulling up the average cost. Now that we've added in average cost, we can see that anything above average cost at that level of output represents what we call abnormal profit. So that's profit above and beyond what they required to cover their costs, but also to match opportunity cost. So the shaded rectangle now, above the average cost curve and below P star, the equilibrium price, represents the abnormal profit which is captured by the monopolist. The area that is now designated ABP star represents consumer surplus. So this is a benefit to the consumer because they were willing to pay greater than P star. So this is consumer surplus. Identifying the consumer surplus is really important when we're looking at the difference in consumer surplus associated with monopolies and perfectly competitive markets. So A, B, P star is a consumer surplus. Remember the opposite or related concept of producer surplus. So the producer surplus is everything above marginal cost, which arises because some producers would be willing to produce some of the units of this product at a price below P star. So our consumer surplus was AB P star, and our producer surplus is the area shown in the triangle P star, B, Q star, and then for completeness we need to have 0 where the axes meet. So the area below P star B is our producer surplus. Now it's at this point that we need to think about the concept of welfare. And very often you're asked to make a contrast between the size of consumer surplus that you get in a perfectly competitive market and the type of consumer surplus or size of consumer surplus you get under monopoly. So we need to change the labels on our axes so that we can make this welfare comparison. At this point, I've amended the labels on marginal cost to become social marginal cost and demand to become social marginal benefit. Now you can immediately see that if we were welfare maximising, our optimal level of output would come from point S. So point S is our equilibrium. If we extrapolate down, we would have Q welfare maximising, so a much greater level of output. Similarly, if we were welfare maximising, higher level of output would be associated with a lower price, so we'd be at PWM, price welfare maximising. So if we were to look at consumer surplus now, then our consumer surplus at this new equilibrium price would be shown by the area A price WM S. So from the small triangle here above P star and B to point A, we now have this much greater triangle A PWM S. Similarly, the producer surplus has changed shape. So the producer surplus becomes PW